Episode 8 of Band of Brothers, titled The Last Patrol, is an episode that feels like it is a real turning point in the series, and it's one that really tried to get that feeling across. It's almost like what episode 2 was right at the start. The men had finished their time at Toccoa and were about to embark into Normandy on D-Day, marking their first involvement in the war. Whereas with this episode, this was the men from Easy leaving Hagenau and being taken off of the line, with the end of the war being something that was potentially in sight. With this episode being specifically focused on Webster, a member of Easy that had been absent since Holland, we saw what he went through to earn the respect of the men again. But we also saw Captain Winters showing exactly why he was respected, with the real human side of him coming out. So with that, let's get into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is a breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 8. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. The interviews. As we have in every episode, this episode started out with the interviews from the veterans from Easy Company, something which is always extremely valuable, adds a lot of context and gives us real thinking points whilst the episode goes on, because a lot of what we see ends up relating back to the few short sentences that were mentioned at the start. The interviews in this episode almost had two halves to them in what was being discussed. Within this section, we had Carwood Lipton, Joe Lesniewski, Donald Malarkey, Forrest Guth, and Richard Winters. The first half of the interviews were focused on what happened in Bastogne and how many of the men were lost whilst they were out there. People that they were close to, and you could see the feeling that many of them had within them, even during the time of filming at the turn of the century over 50 years later. They were still mourning the people that they were close to back then. Malarkey's interview specifically was one where you could see the emotion that was inside of him and it building up when talking about how he didn't want to see the person that he was once so close to in the state that they were in. The emotion in his part of the interview was something that I feel we also felt in the latter part of the episode, due to us seeing him having lost all of the people that he was closest to in the previous episode of the show. However, after we heard them addressing what happened in Bastogne, it then went to Richard Winters, where he mentioned how there was a slight feeling in the air. A feeling that the war was going to ease, and that the feeling being present altered the mindset of many of the people there. People believed that they might just make it through it if they trod carefully. This was something which was interesting to hear, because up until this point in the show, there'd never been any sign of that. When we look at where they'd just come from, Bastogne, where there were casualties and deaths that hit them, there was now an ounce of positivity for the first time. This is a positivity that's probably quite nice to have, but I suppose it would give you the mindset that there's more to lose, because you would have come so far by that point, so it probably doesn't serve the mind that well. It's interesting that we heard Winters say this in the interview, because obviously in the latter part of the episode he made the decision to call off the second mission to get the prisoners from the German side of the river, because he didn't want to risk the lives of his men when there was that feeling of positivity and hopefulness of being so close to surviving the war. These interviews were ones that really stuck with me throughout the episode, and you could see the direct correlation in the episode, whether it be the behaviour of certain individuals or even the mindset that was behind the eyes of some of the men. February 9th, 1945. So the episode opened up on February the 9th, 1945 in Hagenau, and we had a voiceover from an individual that we'd seen in the early parts of the series, more so in the background, but in this episode, they were the person that was going to be front and centre. This was Private David Webster. What was particularly interesting was that a lot of what Webster said throughout the episode was connected to what Winters said in the interviews that took place during the beginning. He said how it felt as though there was hope and optimism that they might make it out of the war. And he also said how back home in the States, things were starting to look like they were getting back to what they were like pre the war. Businesses were booming and tourism was on the rise, with hotels being booked out in Miami. However, even though that was the case, there was still a war that needed to be won. There were lives that were being claimed, and it really set apart the two different sides to the world when it came to the back end of the war. Whilst back home it might have felt like victory was on the horizon, the men in Europe were about to embark into some of the most critical moments. When Webster arrived in Hagenau, he went over to the men that he knew from before. However, he was being treated differently this time. He'd been with them since Toccoa, dropped on D-Day and fought alongside them, but after being wounded and staying in hospital for a long while and not fighting to get out of there to get back alongside them, it made many of the other men lose respect for him. This is because many of the other men, such as Paconti, Toy, Popeye, and many others, would rather be alongside their brothers and comrades rather than be in a hospital bed and feel as though they weren't contributing. This was something that occurred with the real-life David Webster. David Webster trained with Fox Company of the 2nd Battalion at Camp Toccoa, and after he dropped in Normandy on D-Day, he requested a transfer to Easy Company, something which was granted. Webster participated in the D-Day landing, Operation Market Garden, but was wounded in the crossroads by machine gun fire. From there, he was evacuated to the hospital and spent several months recovering in England. In February 1945, which is when this episode was set, he was released and rejoined the company. However, he saw a regiment which he almost didn't recognize. A few months at war can make a large difference, and he noticed that they were missing men due to the Battle of the Bulge, and the men that were there were tired and angry with him over his absence. This was something that was extremely prominent in the episode and ran throughout the most part of it. Webster's mindset was something that was totally different to everybody else because he'd spent the last few months not participating in the war. He was almost excited to see everybody, when everybody else was mourning the friends that they'd lost. Webster was almost being viewed and treated like a replacement. Maybe even worse, because it seemed as though he was actively avoiding going back on the line. Other moments where this was apparent was when he was in line to take a shower, despite the fact he probably had one not that long ago and the other men hadn't had one in quite a while. Comments about him being in the line for it were being thrown his way. After we saw the introduction of Webster, we saw what the entirety of the episode was going to be about. A prisoner snatch that would be taking place on the other side of the river. They wanted to capture some German troops and bring them in as prisoners so that they could get them to talk and spill any intel that could be valuable. The plan was for 15 men to go across the river with no helmets at 1 AM in the cover of darkness and get the prisoners. This was essentially the last patrol that the title of the episode was referring to. You could tell that the mindset of the men had changed, and previously they were participating in what they needed to do. But the ambiguity of the 15 men that were being randomly selected was something that put fear within all of them, because none of them wanted to be killed or severely wounded this close to what felt like the finish line. At this point in time too, we were also introduced to a new individual called Lieutenant Jones, a person who was played by Tom Hanks' son, Colin Hanks. Lieutenant Jones had graduated from West Point on D-Day and didn't have any first-hand experience within the war. He was what they call the career soldier and was fresh amongst these men. What was clear from the off was that he wasn't used to the war, and even graduating from the military academy, which is West Point, it was no comparison to actually living, breathing, and fighting during the war. Many of the procedures and behaviors that had been instilled in Jones at West Point was something that he was carrying out in practicality, but many of the other men weren't because they saw through it. The atmosphere of the war at this point was something that was summed up quite well during the discussion that was taking place between Jones and Malarkey. Jones said, "They haven't made any attempts to cross the river," when referring to the German men. And then Malarkey responded by saying, "I don't think anybody wants to do anything stupid at this point," showing that on both sides of the war, it felt like it was coming to an end, and nobody wanted to lose their life at that moment in time. Going from this conversation to a moment that was in complete contrast was when Bill Keane was found dead outside. He was hit whilst carrying a sack of potatoes from one building to another, showing again how easy it was for your life to be claimed in a moment that you simply would have never expected. With regards to the prisoner snatch, Malarkey was being placed as the person to lead the troops, something which put fear within many of the men there. Malarkey had seen his fair share of action and had also seen his fair share of death and loss of the people that he cared about most whilst out there. This was something that was within his entire demeanour throughout the first half of the episode until he was eventually removed from the 15 men. You could see that his mind was filled with darkness and despair, and like he just wanted to be done with it all. The troops felt like he had nothing to live for, and that made them fear for their own safety. Lieutenant Jones wanted to go on the prisoner snatch to show that he could be valuable. However, Winters was reluctant to do so because he didn't have any experience. And in this crucial time, they wanted no casualties, and that required somebody who Winters could trust to be heading the mission up. Hence why Malarkey was chosen, but then ultimately Martin. However, Jones was eventually allowed to go along as an observer because they needed an officer there. Within reality, it was actually said that he didn't go on the prisoner snatch, and neither did Webster. However, Jones did carry out a patrol prior to this, and he was praised for the way that he conducted himself whilst on it. Webster and Jones formed some kind of bond in this episode because they were the two outsiders amongst the troops. It wasn't a deep friendship, but it was one of mutual respect. They helped each other out when it was necessary because they understood what the other was going through. Prior to the operation taking place, we heard a story about a replacement in D Company from West Point, the place where Jones graduated from, and we heard that he had his foot blown off. This was something which it was clear to see got inside of Jones's head as the camera cut to him, and he realized that if somebody from West Point could have that happen to them, then there was nothing stopping it from happening to him. When it came to the briefing of the meeting, we saw that Webster was picked as one of the men to go on the prisoner snatch due to the fact that he could speak German. However, Liebgott could also speak German. When Webster was asked if he could speak the language, he said, a little, despite the fact that it was to an extremely high standard. He just didn't want to go on the snatch and get put in a dangerous position. This is something which is actually true to the behavioral traits of the real David Webster. It was said that he made it a rule of his army life to never do anything voluntarily. He was said to be an intellectual and an observer, hence why he had that reluctance whenever we saw him during the show, because that was a true trait of the real-life person. Once the briefing was done, there was a montage of the men preparing their weapons, removing anything that could make noise and just looking like they were in deep thought. I felt like we hadn't really had a moment like this in the show since the men were up in the planes getting ready to drop on D-Day. Like I said at the start of the video, this was a monumental moment for them, just like what the landing in Normandy was. The drop marked them entering the war, and this final patrol was them wanting to make it back alive because they were on the cusp of going home. So I thought the collection of shots was an interesting choice to include, and it suited the mood and tone really well. Tying back to just how dangerous the mission was within Webster's voiceover. He mentioned how the mission could provide success in 10 minutes, or all of the men could be killed when they crossed the river. It showed the two extremes that were possible and how you almost didn't know what was going to happen, walking into the jaws of conflict where death was an extreme possibility. I thought the men looked so exposed when they made it across the river and they were crawling along the ground. Not having any helmets on, leaving their heads like an open target was something that just made me feel that sense of vulnerability that they were in during that specific moment. Even the sound of the wire cutting felt like it was just reverberating around the environment and was extremely loud. During the operation, Eugene Jackson, one of the men, was severely wounded by grenade shrapnel when it went off right in front of him as he entered the door to the room with the prisoners in. It was said that Jackson lied about his age and enlisted in the army when he was 16 years old, and he was only 19 when he died. Jackson participated in the Battle of the Bulge, and the real story of his actions were that of when Bill Garnier and Joe Toyer were severely wounded. A jeep carrying ammo drove by and refused to take the men to the aid station, but Jackson threatened the jeep driver, and following that, the driver then took them to the station. Even though in the show Jackson was killed due to the grenade that he threw, the authenticity of that is questioned, as many others suggest that it might have been a German grenade. Webster's voiceover after Jackson's death was something that was so haunting to hear. He mentioned how in the letter home to his parents that he would be described as dying a hero in a situation that was far different to reality, screaming in the basement with all of his friends looking on. Jackson is a hero, that's for sure, so it doesn't take away from that, but the nature of the death is something that I suppose would prevent his parents from knowing that he suffered and was calling out how he didn't want to die in his final moments. One thing that I thought was quite interesting during the scene in the basement was when Eugene Rowe entered. The whole atmosphere just changed. Everybody went quiet and Doc Rowe was able to assess the situation. It simply showed that by having a medic around, it did provide a sense of calmness that couldn't be achieved when there wasn't one around. With the success of the first patrol in getting prisoners that talked and spilled information, Colonel Sink wanted the men to go on another patrol the following evening. Sink saw it as a success, but Winters didn't, because there was a man that lost his life, a man that was so close to making it out of the war on the other side. This was where we saw a real human side to Captain Winters coming out, and it highlighted how much he valued the lives of the men that were in front of him. He saw them as people that he truly cared about, and I imagine that's why he was so respected by them all. The men would have to go deeper into the area in order to get more prisoners, which most likely increased the chance of there being fatalities, and that was something that Winters didn't want to happen. So he instead told the men to lie about the patrol and to get a full night's sleep instead, because the following day they were going to be taken off the line. Winters didn't want any man to lose their life a mere matter of hours away from being taken off of the line and removed from immediate danger. Jones's reaction to this was something that I thought was particularly interesting. It was against the rules going against your superior, but I think he saw that the rulebook isn't always there to be followed when it comes to the lives of the men that you're leading. The character Jones learned a lot in the short time that he was with Easy Company, and most probably the power of just being human. Lieutenant Jones was promoted to first lieutenant following his time with Easy and was sent up to the regiment as a staff officer. Within real life, after the war, Jones wasn't discharged and he stayed in Germany where he was promoted to captain. Jones never ended up returning to the United States, and following an automobile accident that he got in whilst in Berlin, he died following an operation that was carried out because of it. Lieutenant Jones died on the 21st of July 1947. With regards to Webster, his time in Hagenau was something which was a bit of a turning point for him. Because he was involved in the prisoner snatch and participated, he was seen as an equal amongst the men again, something which was best shown to us through the hand that was given to him when he was getting back on the truck. With regards to the real-life David Webster, he did go on to survive the war, however there was tragedy within his life not long after. At the end of the war, he was the last of the Camp Toccoa veterans to be sent home, and when he was discharged, he worked as a journalist. His hobbies were sailing and fishing, and that would be the very thing that would lead to his demise. In 1961, Webster went on a fishing trip where he left in the morning and planned on returning in the afternoon. However, he failed to return. His boat was discovered, but there was an oar and a tiller that was missing. David Webster's body was never found and he was declared lost at sea. This was at only 39 years of age. At the end of the episode, we also saw that Winters was promoted to Major. Right at the end of the episode, there was the text that usually appears on screen which summarizes what happened in reality, and this text concluded by saying that the men would soon be entering Germany. The show had been building to this exact moment. They'd started in France, and episode by episode got deeper and deeper into Europe, so seeing those simple words on screen showed the progress that had been made, and it left me on the edge of my seat even more, ready for the next episode. My review of the episode. I thought that episode 8 was a good episode of the show. It's definitely not my favourite, but the tonal difference is one that I quite like. The mood is quite flat throughout it because many of the men just want to go home and feel like they're nearing the end. Cobb's outburst after he'd had a drink was something that summed it up too. He was fed up with taking orders and was just done. I thought Ian Bailey delivered a really strong performance in this episode of the show, along with Colin Hanks. You felt the ostracization that they carried on their shoulders and how lonely it could be whilst you were kept on the outside whilst only wanting to be accepted. I thought the scenes where the men were crossing the river were some of the tensest in the show. This was all about stealth, silence, and meticulous planning, and you almost felt like you couldn't breathe whilst they were approaching the outpost. Episode 8 isn't the highest rated episode or the episode that I think of first when I think of Band of Brothers. I actually think it's probably one of the more forgettable episodes, but that doesn't mean it's a bad one in the slightest. I just think there are many other episodes that come to mind that are maybe more powerful and have more emotional weight behind them. That being said, I do like the tone and feel that this episode gives off. It's one of optimism, but one that has a deep-rooted sense of fear of falling before the final hurdle, so there's a real sense of conflict within it. Episode 9 is arguably one of the most powerful episodes in the entirety of the series, so it's one that I'm looking forward to delving into next. So, there you have it, my breakdown of Band of Brothers episode 8. If you want to see more videos on Band of Brothers, then click on the card in the top corner. There's an entire playlist where I break down every episode, or alternatively you can head over to my channel where you'll find them all. I've also started breaking down the Pacific. The first breakdown of that show is up on the channel too. What did you think of episode 8? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.